För 10 år sedan, några år innan vi fick vår senaste läroplan här i Sverige, så fick Australien sin första läroplan. Eller i alla fall sin första som gäller för hela Australien. Det har ju tidigare varit indelat i provinser och provinsiella läroplaner. Och uppdraget att utforma ramverket för kursplanen i engelska och leda det arbetet, det gick till Peter Freebody. Mycket värdigt så, eftersom Peter Freebody är och har varit en mycket tongivande, inflytelserik och internationellt erkänd litteracitetsforskare. Och vi såg ju faktiskt igår också, när Karin Franker presenterade, att även i ett land som Sverige, i vår litteracitetskampanj som Läslyftet utgör, så har Peter Freebody varit en bärande teoretisk input och faktiskt påverkat även undervisningen här i Sverige. Och naturligtvis också genom sin mycket kända modell tillsammans med Alan Luke, The Four Resources Model, som också Karin Franker pratade utifrån. Och vi har ju också under de här dagarna upptäckt att det här med litteracitet är ett otroligt brett begrepp. Orden räcker inte till när man ska beskriva det. Så att den här titeln som Peter nu har på sin presentation, Literacy, Learning and Teaching in the Multi-Everything Classroom, är ju spot on. So, Mr. Freebody, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first, to the organizing committee, thank you for the invitation. Tack för inbjudan. And that's it. It's the end of my Swedish. And Bjorn, thank you for what I hope was a generous introduction. Some cautions to start with. I taught school a very long time ago, so long ago it really doesn't matter. So I don't present myself to you as a teacher. Rather as a researcher in the area of literacy education, which has taken me to observe many, many classrooms across 4 or 5 different countries. But at the same time, I can't lay claim to being a teacher, therefore I don't live inside the sorts of pressures and issues that you do, but I've interviewed a lot of teachers. So I bring to you what I hope good researchers will continue to bring to you, which is to put before you issues that we think are emerging and that are powerful things for your consideration. And a couple of those things I want to try to convince you of by the end of this session is that firstly there is a very real sense in which whatever the test regimes are and whatever the job requirements are around literacy, that literacy is, and for a long time, a very long time, has been understood to be deeply about citizenship. It is about taking part, being an active member of a certain kind of society. It draws students, young people, into adult life, and it affords them certain skills, dispositions, bodies of knowledge, dispositions in particular of inquiry and critique. And those have their most powerful functions as they grow and become citizens. And I want to make that point even more strong with respect to the features of the current situation, which I'll talk about from my point of view, and the pressures that those circumstances, those conditions place upon literacy education and schooling in general in democracies. When you have periods of rapid change, and we do in terms of the 3 things I want to talk about today is I tried to do something straightforward, but it just came out as everything all the time, so I put that. About literacy's role in the development of disciplinary understandings, curriculum-specific understandings, about the issue of diversity, and about the issue of digital, online, and mobile environments that we live in, the dome, as it's sometimes called. So I want to talk about those things, and I hope you come away with the sense that, at least I believe, that these rapidly changing conditions put special pressures on you, on literacy education, especially in times of democracy, because as in Sweden, as in Australia, they come out of school and they vote. And that's a really important aspect of what we, that role of citizenship that we have to take account of. I also want to try to convince you that one of the big outcomes for me from this excellent 2 days of work that we've done here is an understanding that one of the ways forward for us is not to be looking for elsewhere necessarily for research findings we can simply open up and use like a toolkit in the classroom, but in fact to accompany our understanding of what goes on around the world with some locally grown, patient, consistent research and development programs that collaborations among teachers, policymakers, curriculum designers, and researchers. And I think that's one of the important issues, particularly for the situation in which you find yourself. But first, if I can make this work, oops, that's what it was. An example, a local example to start. Now, when I was in a graduate school, they told me you really shouldn't bother looking at research that's much older than 10 years or so, that it's probably a bit out of date. This project is a little older than that. It's in fact 320 years older than that. And it's about a reading intervention program in the little Swedish village of Tuna in Medelpad, I think is how you say that. Did I get that? It doesn't matter. They wanted to look at the ways in which community-based literacy, reading education in this case, could actually work, whether or not it worked in a small community, small enough that they could kind of get a grip on it, and small enough that they could give advice to the local churches and community leaders and parents about how to go about these things, and adult-to-adult education as well. And the results are pretty interesting. It turns out that they actually, now they didn't do the kind of statistics we'd want to see, but they actually, if you look at the figures here, they didn't need to really. Basically what they found was that as they worked away over a 3-year period, you can see the contrasting figures in orange, that they basically, and they had 3 categories: cannot read, beginning to read, and can read, which is not exactly a standardized test score, but it's probably pretty good. And they found these sorts of things. And they talked about how they would systematically go about it as well. So here is a study from 330 years ago that worked. You know what works, the What Work Clearinghouse? It's not there. It's not on the What Works Clearinghouse. But it is nonetheless a study in a contained community which contained the full range of demographics. And it's published by, it is written up lovingly in a labour of love by Egil Johansson, who was a professor here and who passed away a few years ago. And his book on the history of literacy in Sweden, which is an extremely interesting read and which shows the depth and the longevity of the study of literacy education and the length of time at which they have understood why it is it matters. So what he found was, what they found in the nature of this was not just how many could and couldn't, but that the whole system had, the understandings of what it meant to read had changed from memorizing and reciting. So they looked just at those people in Tuna who knew their catechism. You can get it. You can see where this is going to go. And there they are. There's all the people that knew their catechism, and there's the people who knew it because they could recite it off by heart but couldn't read about it. And there's the people that could, and there's their age groups, and they fixed this thing. And what he wants to say is, this is how far the old education reached, the late 1600s. From that point on, we knew there was something else afoot, beyond just rote instruction and memorization. So why? How come this happened? 100 years before the Europeans arrived on the coast of Australia. Arrived is putting it very politely, I have to say. Why did this happen in Sweden? Well, there's a couple of simple reasons. Because the Counter-Reformation, as you know, was in full flight from the late 1500s on in the rest of Europe. The Catholic Church was fighting back, and in all sorts of interesting ways. And it happened that Lutheranism was, one of its key targets. In particular, a set of beliefs that had to do with the Virgin Mary and the Eucharist. But they didn't want just to teach Swedes and Lutherans that this was wrong and learn how to recite why it's wrong, the 3 reasons why it's wrong. They wanted to read about it, particularly in the sacred text, but not just in the sacred text, in Luther's as well. This is a bas-relief from a cathedral door in Paris. You can see, I don't know what you can see, but you can see the avenging angel with her shield, which has got the fleur-de-lis on it. Okay? You can see the Virgin Mary holding the Eucharist. These are the worship of the Virgin Mary and the Eucharist are 2 hot points of contention in the Lutheran Reform movement. Because in Tuna and in the rest of Sweden and in other parts of the Nordic world in particular, this was about building community. It wasn't just about building catechismic knowledge. It was about building community, a shared moral framework, shared processes for building our knowledge and our understanding. In a sense, the Protestant ethic of communicating directly with God through the scriptures rather than via the priesthood and an illiterate community. Those days were gone as far as these communities. In a sense, then, it's about a democracy that's informed by collective and reflective individuals. What you can't see, probably, is that the fallen bodies, the people who are being obliterated or at least about to be tortured and killed, are lying on a pile of books. And the book at the far bottom right corner, which you can't see, has got a serpent around it, which you probably can see, and it's got words engraved in it. And the words are Martin Luther. Now, the French are much more subtle these days, but they weren't very subtle when it came to these sorts of issues. And what the Lutherans realized, what the people of Tuna realized, and the other church and governmental authorities of Sweden at the time realized that this was primordially about literacy, about reading, about a reading community, a community that could do that sort of work. And for Professor Johansson, everything was concentrated on comprehending, understanding, putting the words into practice in everyday life. We talked about this morning, authentic issues. We talked about it yesterday, right from the very powerful first session that Karin and others put together. Authenticity, the significance of practice in everyday life, and reading and writing in that was not an end in itself, a question of experiencing the total environment of this society. So these understandings have to be kept in mind when we start talking about standardized testing and explicit teaching and authenticity and those sorts of things. These are not new issues in human history. They've been around a long time, and they have always, when they have been shown to work, they have connected very deeply with powerful currents and systematic changes that were afoot in the societies. I have a slightly more recent example. You'll be pleased to know, it doesn't end there. One of the things about literacy and talking to people like you is that you've been literate for so long, it's almost impossible for you to imagine what it's like not to be able to sound out the letters and read the words and understand. It's like going to a doctor who's never been sick, you know. You're having teachers who don't really know how it feels in their bones to have had it for so long. So Brian Street, my late departed, sadly dear friend, used to say to me, you know, with literacy you should creep up on it from behind so it doesn't see you coming. Then you suddenly realize it's partly about this. Here's an example where we can creep up on it. David Leiser at the Ben Gurion University in Israel and his colleagues did a big study of the global financial crisis. And they wanted to know why it happened, why do people think this thing happened, and how do you fix it? What should be done about it? Okay? And what they did was they surveyed that many people in those countries. They interviewed them, and they ranked their possible explanations and remedies, and how people wrote about how it affected them and so on. There was a lot of findings that they came up with, but there was a couple that are very, very significant from the point of view when we start talking about the role of literacy in knowledge building and the role of the disciplines that can be accessed only in our systems through the written word. This is a good or bad idea, our literacy system, our school systems are virtually entirely literacy dependent. We live in literacy-saturated societies, and we live in literacy-saturated schools, and that's where children need to achieve. Well, what did they find? They found that about 80% of the people thought that basically this financial crisis had occurred because of failings of moral or cognitive character, which is a polite way of saying that most people, the vast majority of people, thought that the global financial crisis occurred because there are people who are bad or people who are stupid or people who are both. Okay? And the remedy, guess what, is move them on. Get rid of them, okay? 20% of people saw the economy as a set of interacting systems and took the view that there's always been bad and stupid people, always, right? But when systems are interlocking, when things go wrong in one place and it echoes all the way through, in this case around the world, that's different. That's about a system-based understanding, and that they saw the system, you can see the quote, complex, objective, soulless mechanisms. And the remedy is change the system. Now, one of the reasons, and the final finding they found, is that the second group had a strong statistical effect in favour of the minority group in terms of socioeconomic status and education levels. So in a democracy, and you've done your focus group and you're running for office, guess which policy you're going to put forward? You want the 80% to vote for you, or do you want to get the 20% to vote for you? The 20% are better educated, okay, which means they've gone through more lengthy study, more detailed study, and they have, in a sense, you don't get that level of education without a deep access of the systems involved, the systematic thinking involved in the ways in which human systems, biological systems, social systems, economic systems, cultural systems, and so on, thinking that way about people as opposed to thinking these people are bad or these people are stupid and these people are both. Notice that what was told to them and the way these things were expressed is, in a sense, the genre of morality, which is the narrative. The primary vehicle for expressing moral issues, pluses and minuses, and good people and stupid people, is the story. They told stories. The people, the minority, didn't tell stories. They explained systems in this sort of soulless way. Now, there's always, as I say, been bad and stupid. Maybe there just happened to be a hell of a lot more bad and stupid people in 2008. Probably not. But what you can notice is that almost every government has in place the policies that actually led to the creation of the financial crisis still. Okay? Because that's the 80%. And in a democracy, there is pressure on government to stay in government. So that's just creeping up on literacy from another angle altogether to try to demonstrate this point about one of the things that the disciplines variously offer us, including literary criticism and the study of literature, is a way beyond the narrative, a way of understanding human conditions in different kinds of ways, different kinds of scalpels for cutting beneath the surface of our experience. So I want to talk firstly about that. I'm going to talk about disciplines, then I'm going to talk about diversity, and then I'm going to talk about the dome. How do disciplines differ? Well, there's some pretty obvious answers to that. I want to talk about, they're not just, obviously they're not just different collections of topics. They're different ways of inquiring about those things, different ways of thinking about those things, different forms of talk and thought, and therefore literate enterprises. They're different literate enterprises, okay? Part of the reason we induct children into schooling is this sort of old joke that people tell is, you know, in Australia it's illegal not to go to school, not to be institutionalised for at least 11 years, right? In Australia you don't get 11 years for armed robbery, but you do for being 5. Okay? So there must be something big in mind, and that something big we have traditionally done since way before the Renaissance, in fact, even in the old Roman curriculum, was to put these cherished bodies of knowledge and thought and practice, intellectual practice and moral practice, into a format that we can understand and deliver them via literacy. There's a book I've always loved by Susan MacDonald. It's very old now. But she did a study of how these texts work within the humanities. And she wants to say there's 4 kinds of ways we can think about how disciplines differ. And the first way, you can see that the graphics of this escaped me in the end, is that the disciplines have different ways of identifying the central puzzle. She called some disciplines urban disciplines, where a whole lot of people study a very small number of problems. Physics and mathematics are like this. So it's like Manhattan. There's all these people living on this tiny block of land. Okay? And others more rural, others are less compact, more diffuse. Anthropologists study bits and bobs of different kinds of things from all over, different scopes and so on. It's also the case that the criteria for the production of knowledge are different. In some disciplines, it's very clear you can't talk like this about what's true and what's not unless you follow these rules. Psychology is a good example of this. Everyday practices that we think we understand commonsensically have to be analysed and talked about in very specific ways. Notice, keep asking yourself how many of our colleagues in high school have a clear understanding of what work gets done. Because in Australia, a kid goes from one to the other subject every 50 minutes. So if that kid's just hanging on academically, then these kinds of changes that don't seem to be explicated very much, right, just pass on. And advocacy versus knowledge production. Sorry, I missed that one. Some interpret the world rather than explain it. Some allow advocacy rather than just neutral knowledge production. These disciplines come to us, and this is a very important piece of work that I've talked about for a long time. It's two Australian researchers, Frances Christie and Beverly Deribianca. Beverly's already had a mention here earlier from Deb Myhill, in a book called School Discourse. And they looked at the reading and writing demands on students from preschool, or kindergarten, first year of schooling, through to year 12. And they looked at the kind of genre, what different kind of work gets done in English and history and science. And I'm just going to very briefly, some of you know this work already, I'm going to very briefly talk about, there's also some work done by myself and Carl Mayton and Jim Martin in that edition there, about why this matters. And I'll just use history as an example to give you a feeling for it, rather than English and science, and because I talked to Bjorn and he used to be a history teacher, so that's why we're doing history. Okay. They found three kinds of work that gets done. Chronological work, right? Work passages, changes through time, non-chronological work, and rhetorical work, work that is about texts and text structures. And you can see here, early primary, you can see how this works, okay? So if we look at these kinds of things, we find kids in early primary giving recounts of personal experience. You can almost see this as a kind of evolutionary process, okay? Intellectual, knowledge-based changes as they go through. Middle primary, they do biography. They transition into a thing called biography. And then late primary, when things, and this is one of the things they find generally, things become very complicated for kids in the late primary school. We're talking here about years, the 5th, 6th, and 7th years of schooling, okay? I know you have slightly different ages around these things, and you see how the arrows mean that's carried through. What happens in middle secondary is that explanations, does this work? Yeah, and factors, interpretations of site studies, and this issue here, historiography, how it is that history is made, not just what happened or how we can interpret it, but how is it built? How do historians do their work? So that, it seems to me, notice that this is not just structural, genre-based changes in the way we read and write. This is actually different kind of intellectual work, okay? So if we're thinking about kids coming in with languages other than Swedish or languages other than English, we can also start to see that some of the grammatical formulations around this, particularly this phase in late primary and early secondary, are really a different kind of language, way of using language as well. It's not as dramatic as having to learn Swedish when you speak Arabic, obviously, but it is nonetheless the acquisition of something you thought you knew, that you have a way of using in daily life. They also had, from the three subjects they talked about, history, science, and English, they developed an overall roadmap that seems to summarize the sequence of events and the grammatical formations that use. So this is meant to supplement in a little bit what Deborah talked about this morning. Simple, Common sense knowledge expressed in congruent language. Congruent language is when, things are talked about as nouns and processes are talked about as verbs. And, dog bites man, man bites dog, right? Noun, verb, that kind of thing. What the actual happening event is expressed congruently. Commonsensical knowledge, there's no layer on the top of it. And the straightforward attitudinal evaluator, do you like this? Which character do you like best? And so on. That then grows as they proceed into slightly less commonsensical knowledge, but it's elaborated in the beginning, in mid-childhood and early adolescence, as the resources expand. And this issue of nominalization occurs, which many of you know about. It's when a process, sometimes a very complex process of events, of happenings, is turned into a noun. Evaporation, for example. It's actually a set of verbs, a set of processes going through time, but we give it a noun because nouns are the things we can talk about most. We can talk about rapid evaluation and evaporation, things like that. So we can make more complex statements about nouns, and that's how it's done, not just in English or in Swedish, but in most languages. One of the key issues of academic language. Knowledge becomes more commonsensical. Schooling's not about common sense. It's not about making fun of common sense. It's about giving a completely different set of repertoires to deal with different kinds of problems. Complex embedded clauses, expanded attitudinal and evaluative comments. And finally, in senior, non-congruent language, passives, embedded clauses, multiple embeddings, and abstractions, and so on and so on. You don't get asked which character you like best in Hamlet in Year 12, the way you did in Year 2. Not with Hamlet, but whatever the story was. So there's a whole different... You don't get asked in chemistry, how do you think zircon feels being down the bottom of the table of elements, You don't get asked that. It's not that kind of a subject area, okay? So notice, first of all, how rapidly young people are expected to acquire this process, okay? To overlay what they thought they knew about how to talk with these increasingly complex evolutions through these processes. What they found was that a lot of students come off this developmental program between bullet 2 and bullet 3, about when they go to high school. There's a lot of kids still here who are still using congruent language and simple evaluations and simple clause structures and so on. So, this process is very fast and it leaves, as it stands, it leaves a lot of kids behind. One of the arguments that they make is to do with the fact that they would want to say that if teachers don't explicitly, if teachers of science and history and whatever else, English, don't have explicit understandings of not just what we're dealing with here in grade 6 or in year 6, but also how that forms a platform for what they're going to have to do next, that there is an evolutionary shift about to happen, and it will keep happening. And it goes and intensifies. So in a sense, there's already a strong case for understanding the alignments that teachers need to share from year to year, and in the case of high school students, from hour to hour, that the kids are moving from one different set of things to another. But that this process is... So it seems to me that's the first study that I've ever found that has looked in that scale, and this took them years, to look at what kids had to read and write and just ask the question, how does it change in these subjects? So we can give a standardized reading test or a writing test here in Year 9, but it probably isn't what the kids in Year 9, the 14, 15-year-olds, go to school worrying about. They probably go to school worrying about the lab report for science, right, or the history project or whatever. You do what you think is the right thing, you've done your research, you write it up, you don't get any grades. Because this is not the program. So one of the rules I want to talk, one of the generalizations, is that if teachers don't have these understandings explicitly available, then they're not available pedagogically to their students. You can keep doing, well, it sounds like this, it looks like this, but if you don't have any, as Deborah's point about labeling and understanding, not that it's a set of rules, but you can talk about these things, okay, if you if you have a set of understandings as to how they work. Otherwise, and notice, it's not just the language formations. I'm going to keep, I hope, folding back onto issues to do with narrativizations. That the formats that the kids that come off the program, they are left here writing stories. If you've ever taught senior, you know that some of the students retell the story of a poem or of a novel or of whatever. They're in narrative mode still. They haven't made that transition that Lysa and his colleagues in Ben Gurion found. I want to briefly talk about multimodal issues as well. The people whose work I know best in this field are Len Unsworth and Mary Mackin-Hararik, and Evelyn Chan is one of their colleagues as well. And they have talked about, looked at the ways in which multimodal representations, basically images, change. They wanted to know that question. They documented the responses of students in elementary, secondary to the pictures that they encountered in school books. And they wanted to know if they could map out developmental landmarks in the way these things occurred. These things, not just the responses, but the actual images themselves occurred. And that's the reference when they do it. So I'll tell you what they talked about and what they found. But they found something that looks very much like the roadmap that I just had up on the thing before. And just a side issue here, if you don't want to keep looking at grandchildren, then you shouldn't ask old people to talk to you, okay? This is my grandson Theo, whom I will be babysitting in 2 days' time. He's gorgeous, right? I mean, you've got to say yes. They wanted to know, what they found is something like this. These guys that make the graphics for these books, textbooks as well as narratives and children's books otherwise, they go through, we seem to find 4 stages whereby students, young through to older students, explain what they think, why they think these drawings are in these books, okay? And the first one is that the younger kids say, well, they're just there because, you know, they're kind of random. They just decided to draw that, or they like drawing dogs, or they, you know, or they did it so that you'd know what was happening. So something strategic. They called it tactical, but it's really more strategic. The second phase that they found the older students had moved in were that that something about the graphic reflected the thoughts or the feelings of the characters in the apparent reality of the story's world. Okay, most of this was storying, but it also went over into issues to do with expository text as well. And they finally, what some of the students made it to was that there's an issue about the crafting of this text. It's made to represent power relations, emotional responses, to draw out things that the words on their own couldn't do. Now, what Unsworth and Mackin-Hararik haven't done is to talk about, the next step is to sort of marry that to an idea that not that the disciplines themselves don't put graphics to work in the same way, okay? If you look about history, you think about history, well, how do they use them? Most graphics in history are about timelines or maps, so things that are too big through time or to really capture or distance to capture in words, or about empathy. You know, Napoleon lost 450,000 French troops on the attempted invasion of Russia. Here's a picture of one dead French soldier and a horse. Okay, you say, well, what's that? That's drawing out, you know, don't forget these are individuals. This is a very big number. Don't forget there's 450,000 of them. That's what it means historically. So again, part of drawing out the emotion. Physics and chemistry and other disciplines use these things for very different sorts of ways. So part of what I want to talk about then is to say one of the powerful understandings that I think we need to not lose track of, and I know you know this, but it's important, I think, to keep reminding ourselves, is that from about the middle primary years, literacy, that the curriculum domains start to put literacy to work, each in its own way, okay? So it's not just so literacy across the curriculum is a bit of not a good name because it implies that there's a thing called literacy and it sort of dances across the curriculum. in a generic way. And of course, spelling and punctuate, all those kinds of mechanical issues are relevant across all of the curriculum domains. But the work that gets done, the intellectual, social, and cultural work, I'm thinking of MacDonald's issue, partitioning of these things, is putting this technology, this powerful technology to work, each discipline in its own image and likeness. And if we want to think about the 4 resources model, then we can think about how those 4 kinds of resources are developed in different kinds of ways as the kid proceeds across the boundary, if you like, or the transition into secondary, into more specialized textual work. But kids aren't all the same. So, diversity. Now, an audience like this, I really don't need to explain diversity to you. But there's a couple of things I think that I could draw into focus. In the National Reading Panel that the United States put together to draw together all of the what works research in reading, you might remember that, it was about 2001, and it has framed up an awful lot of the work that's been done in the United States in terms of literacy assessment and so on. And the person who did the review on which that was based is Catherine Snow from the University of Harvard. She and her colleagues developed a massive review of the literature using very strict criteria about experimental controls and valid and reliable instrumentation and so on, all the things you'd expect. What has been left out of the way in which that review was used in the panel and in the prescription of teaching and testing is the first comment that she made in the preface. If there's anything, this is a direct quote, we have learned from this effort, it is that effective teachers are able to craft a special mix of instructional ingredients for every child they work with. If they've learned, this is Catherine Snow. Catherine Snow is probably, one of the strictest experimentalist educational psychologists. Catherine Snow is not a lady you mess with when it comes to methodology or theory. And for her to start that off, and for that to be largely ignored by most of the applications of her work into the reading panel and into the testing regimes under No Child Left Behind, you remember? No Child Left Behind, no educational psychologist left behind, no measurement theorist left behind. That kind of stuff all came out of that. Now, she goes on to say there is, of course, a common menu, but her vision is of a teacher with a repertoire of practices, right? And who can apply them, but who gets to know the students well enough to be able to apply that responsively. So part of the International Literacy Association now has a series of booklets, which some of you may know, and it's entitled No Instruction Without Differentiation. That's the title of the series, and there's a series of books you can have a look on their site, that kind of thing. They're wanting to say, don't buy the silver bullet, okay? Don't buy the package which you hope when you open it magically in the classroom will produce learning of this generic thing. It's just not what this thing is. There's some other more specific, because one of the things that people say, well, if you've got 25 kids in the class, does that mean there's 25 different ways of learning to read and write? Well, maybe it does, but it's probably the case that there aren't 25 pedagogically relevant different ways of learning. So the question gets to be, how can we frame up what might be, what are the bases that you want to respond to when you think about these sorts of things? And Danielle Dennis has done a nice study of this. She took the measures from the No Child Left Behind, which you can see there, our 5 phonemic, well, you know these things, decoding, orthography, vocabulary, and comprehension. And she looked at 94 people who had been referred to her study in the northeast of the US as struggling readers. She then did a factor analysis, which is a statistical procedure that looks at whether if there are in fact 5 statistically distinct factors in these 5 measures that we have. We've got 5 measures of these things. How many things are really there? So if we had income and weight and height, we might get 2 factors, because weight and height might statistically be effectively the same thing in a statistical sense. We know they're not the same thing, but they operate statistically, and we'd call it size or something like that. She found, in fact, 3 factors. So if you want to look about the 3 factors, again, there's evidence-based stuff. Thinking of Catherine Snow's comment about if we've learned anything, it's about responsive teaching. Each kid, get to know the kid, and then look at what's needed. Now, what kind of parameters might we look for? What she found was there are 3 out of this set: text level comprehension, word knowledge, and fluency. Fluency incorporated a number of the decoding and phonemic awareness things. Statistically, they kind of vanished as separate entities. She then looked at a procedure called cluster analysis, where you group the 94 kids into families that are most like one another. Are they all just kind of the same, got the same profile on these 3 factors? Or do they group into different sorts of things? Is there one big mob that gets above average on this and below on that, and a few outliers? How does it work if you do a cluster analysis of these 94 kids? Let's cluster them into families with similar profiles. And she found this. And here's the 4 groups she found, 4 clusters. And they're amazingly similar in size. Cluster analyses, I've done a lot of these things, and they usually don't work out. There's like a big cluster, and then there's a medium cluster, and there's a couple of space travelers that are out on their own sort of thing. And you can read it across here. Here's the 23 kids here. They're way above the mean in comprehension. They're a bit below the mean on word knowledge, and they're average in their fluency. 29% of them were labelled by the school as having a disability. 81% were poor. In fact, all 4 groups came from poverty backgrounds. And none of them had English as a second language. You use NESB, non-English speaking background. Okay? SSLs, ESLs, whatever. So that's that group. That group there is average on that. They're way above average in their word knowledge. They are way below average in their fluency. They can't decode very much, but they know lots of words. That many have disability, they're poor, and a few of them don't have English as their first language, and so on. You can read it, right? The group that might interest you is this 33 here. 33% of kids in here had lots of vocabulary and were pretty good at fluency, but they didn't know what on earth these texts were about. And they are the kids that didn't have English as their first language. They had non-English speaking background, non-English speaking parents at home. And then the final group was very good at their fluency. They could decode and they couldn't do very much else. And they break down like that. Her point is not that this is what all struggling Year 9 kids look like. Her point is if you go in there with a phonics training package, look at who will get nothing out of that. Right? There's some kids in there that will get nothing. If you think it's one thing we can fix, we're just going to go after comprehension, or we're going to build their vocabulary as a way of coping with Year 9 struggling readers, then here are at least 4 ways in which these profiles break out. So you can miss at least half the group if you think it's about one thing. If you go and find the What Works clearinghouse that says it's about fluency, phonemic awareness, decoding. Yes, it is for some of them. So this is the first case of someone trying to say what is a pedagogically relevant set of clusters that we might find in a group of students like this. Okay. Let me talk about another thing about diversity. Babinski and her colleagues wanted to try to put together the fact that some of the intervention programs for migrant, refugee, minority kids emphasized community understanding and collaboration with families and so on, and some of them emphasized skill building, and these guys had the view that there's no particularly smart reason to separate those. So they developed a program that did both of these, had these 2 components in it. Okay? And this is just one of many studies that many of you would know about what works with kids in minority situations and so on. These are Latino kids in the south of the US. What they found was that this program with these 2 prongs, if you like, had significant effects for the intervention on teachers' implementations of high-impact stuff, and in terms of doing things in the classroom differently that seemed to work, and actual development in the students' learning. And they wanted to say that. kids, the lower levels of English were especially likely to benefit from the teacher's participation in the professional development program. What they wanted to say is, as with an understanding of the pedagogically relevant components of kids struggling in their reading, we've got to understand that having a combination of community contact and collaboration between different layers of administration in schools and the community, as well as high-impact things, seems to work best. I'm dancing pretty quickly at this point, because these are things you kind of know about. If I were to tell you... anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. This is a study here done about specialised intensive language for migrant and refugee kids. These people wanted to find out what the main challenges were, what seemed to work best, and what kinds of issues still were left behind. And the challenges were these, and these you know, I think. They were in the administration of the program. It was a really comprehensive migrant program, refugee students in Australia, really comprehensive attempt to use communities and to use particular, powerful interventions in schooling. And they found that the administration of the program was a problem. They found that other local and government policies that actually actively undermined the program, because they undermined the other supports that families were needing to keep going and doing what they were doing. They found the length of time of the program was too short, which is one reason why if you're going to think about research and development programs, we can't preempt the idea that these kids will pick this up in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. And the transition to mainstream was a problem as well. The two things that interest me here, I mean, you neither know these already, and that bear down on the question of refugee kids and the kinds of kids that many of you deal with, and young people, is to do with the sense of community and a safe place. Many refugee kids are unaccompanied, even though they may be 14 or 15 years old. We know that. It's happening here. We know it's happened in Australia as well. We know as well that for many kids, not just refugee kids, but for many kids in Australia, from different backgrounds, the classroom is the safest place they will be in all week. Emotionally, physically, the safest place they'll be in. For other kids, it's actually the most confusing and difficult place. They also wanted to comment about this, and this I thought might be of relevance here to us, is the issue of saying, well, the lack of awareness among teachers of the impact of the migration experiences and individual histories of these young people is compounded by the importance that policies place and teachers on language acquisition, on progress in language, on testing and making sure everything's moving forward. Okay? That we have the view that pedagogy must be initially right from the start, to do with language, to do with the acquisition of Swedish in its oral and written forms. What these people wanted to say is there's a whole period that probably would be much more profitably spent with a deeper understanding of the experiences that these young people have been through, so that they get the benefits of knowing why it's a safe place, because somebody's actually knows what's happened to them and what that feels like. Okay? And that's what creates the safe place and the sense of community. Right? So there's an issue. It's not about not teaching. It's about understanding, getting kids, as you would know, ready for, open to be educated. Okay, I'll talk about the DOME, digital online. I'll be very fast on this. More grandchildren for you? More beautiful children. This kid's better at the iPad than I am. The DOME I like because it's got a kind of almost, cathedral-like sense to it. It's got little alcoves and it's power. It seems to be up there. I've just been on a tour of the ancient cathedrals, the old cathedrals of Spain, and some of the domes make you really. They say, well, they built this so that you'd feel closer to God. And you look at it and you think, yeah, or further away, depending which way you think about that. But there are affordances that the digital, which, again, there's a whole literature that many of you know well. But it is to do with the fact that these are technologies that have changed. And let me just back up there for 1 minute. when I was in graduate school in Chicago, I did a study, an individual study with a famous person called Lloyd Humphreys, who was elderly at the time, as president of the American Psychological Association. And we're doing factor analyses that I just mentioned, the complex statistical procedures. His advisor, in turn, 30 years before, was Ernest Hilgard, who was a very famous educational psychologist in the US. Hilgard had done his PhD on one factor analysis with 100 students in it, with an old adding machine. It took him 2 years just to do that one analysis, right? And Lloyd said to me whimsically one day, nowadays it takes 1/8 of a second. That's one generation. My son and I did a study, and I was chatting with him on Skype, and he does statistics for the OECD and things like that, and I got to saying that the students in teacher education in Australia were being tested for their literacy because the government wanted to blame non-literate or less literate teachers, the credibility, right? And while he was chatting, he was playing around with the data set. So he then, when we finished discussing it, he said, well, I just looked at the whole PIAC thing and everybody who says they're a teacher and everybody who says their highest degrees in education. I did 3 separate analyses while we were chatting about the grandkids. And I've just done all the statistics around the OECD countries, and it turns out that the Australian and Japanese teachers are the most literate teachers in the OECD. The Netherlands comes third, and then there's a little cluster with Sweden in it, kind of thing. The countries that win on PISA, South Korea and Singapore, their teachers are right down the bottom. So the government is turning attention to a problem which, in fact, not only doesn't exist, we do better than most. So there's 3 generations when he actually had access. He just didn't have access to the 1/8 of a second analysis. He had access. He could bring in the whole of that massive data set, right? So here is basically a 50-year period, and surely that's got to be the most rapid kind of change in how we can analyze and understand massive amounts of knowledge and data in 3 generations. There's never been a time, it seems to me, when anything like that has happened before. Because we now have robotics, we'll probably get even faster at these changes. But there's a whole new thing about this, and it seems to me that with regard to having new arrival kids that don't have Swedish as their first language, there's a real advantage into capitalizing and running some good research and development programs long-term around the use of these technologies. Translation facilities, multimodalities as a way of overcoming, initial vocabulary shortfalls and connections and so on. Portability, they can be anywhere. And immersion in real, augmented, or virtual reality. The Horizon report, the recent Horizon report, makes a lot about how virtual reality projects can really influence, in fact, help kids who do not have the language facilities actually get to very deep and complex understandings. Here's another grandkid. So you see the emotional engagement with her. She was watching some reading or something. I don't know. Anyway. Powerful technologies. She's in an augmented reality situation there. One of the animals in the story was in danger. And I didn't get ethical clearance from her to use that either. So there's an issue about understanding how these new technologies can be used in these ways. Jennifer talked a lot about this yesterday. The issue that, as I kept thinking about with regard to what Jennifer was talking about, is that we don't actually have much good, careful, patient research and development on innovations in those directions. We know it's there, and the people have been doing boosterish talk for 20 years now, more than 20 years, right? How this will change everything. And in a lot of classrooms, it hadn't changed anything, really. And partly because we haven't done the patient research. These things don't just come out when you turn the machine on. The pedagogical affordances don't appear by magic. It's about people like us, like you, doing careful, patient work around what innovations can be done and gradually sharpening them up into field experiments and so on. But like all powerful technologies, like literacy, the dome has its downside. And these smarty pants from RMIT have done a study of about that many stories tweeted by that many people that many times, and they used multiple fact-checking to decide which stories were fake and which stories were true. Okay, in the United States. This is 4 million tweets and Facebook entries and social media things. And fake news travels faster and deeper and penetrates more quickly. So, and all of the graphics are there, and it's an amazing little 3-page report with tons of data in it. And that is what the downside of the dome looks like, and that's the world that they're coming into as well. Okay? So what does it call for? Does it call for panic stations? No. It calls for a systematic effort of a powerful school system, which you have, a well-educated task force in those schools, which you have, and strong initial teacher education and policy formation units, collaborating powerfully, setting up some semi-formal consortiums to work in some of these project areas. We can only discover how we can do this better. We can't look around and find something. It's not going to drop from a parachute from, somewhere else into our desks in Australia or in Sweden. Well, so what? Okay. I've tried to argue for you that in times of rapid change, when national identities and cultural pressures from the inside of a nation and the whole question of a nation gets to be up for grabs, that it puts particular pressure on you, on school systems, okay? Rapid change technologies, rapidly changing workplaces, all of these things happening at once. And if you put in a reactionary, backward-looking testing regime, then you've got a perfect storm. You can't change and you can't not change. Okay? The profession is locked into something, and in my country that means they get beaten up in the press. They have programs that assume that the teacher ed students are less literate than they should be, when in fact they're more literate than pretty much any other national teaching, and so on. Okay? A cycle of policy initiatives which eventually are dropped because they don't work, because they weren't based on any careful, systematic work. These things are changing rapidly as we speak. The precarious nation has emerged. The governments that lack, when you get a government, I was determined to make that comment, when you get a government, good luck with this. But don't do what we did, because we get a new government every few months. We get a new prime minister every time we think about it. He goes on TV and we say, no, somebody else. The whole, what the sociologists are now referring to as consistent legitimacy deficit that governments exist in, right? In 2 weeks, I'm a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and we have our annual symposium. This week, that symposium is called Improving Trust in Our Public Institutions and Political Systems. Good luck with that, right? Bunch of sociologists and political scientists, really bright people, and they're going to look at that. These things, when you get external economic competition from the outside of your country, internal pressures for cultural cohesion, and the kind of acceptance or the belief in a monoculture that is Sweden or that is Australia, then when those things start to shake, as Michael Apple said 30 or 40 years ago, the blame will be turned not upon policy but upon the school system. Who's producing these people that can't get this right? Who's producing the generations that are not doing what the policies say they're supposed to do? There's a quote from that in wrapping up, which I will soon, from Antonio Gramsci that I've always liked, that the people, our ancestors, educators, our professional ancestors, put in a lot of effort and sacrifice to get us here. Not just our professional educators, but the architects that could make this, the carpenters, the people that put in effort and sacrifice that each generation produces in order to create a better life for the next generation. Gramsci put it better than that. Some of effort and sacrifice which the present has cost the past and which the future is costing us now. Okay? It's effort and sacrifice that pays off when it's done properly, when it's accepted. Okay? So in order to produce the kind of Sweden that you want, whatever that might be. It's not for me to tell you that, or the kind of Australia that I would want. It's a question of effort and sacrifice. And in terms of who gets to shape the next generation that will benefit from that, it's us, it's educators. They can be as healthy as you like, they can be as rich as they like, but if they're badly educated, you will pay for that very badly. So we are the chosen profession that accepts the role of exercising the most effort and sacrifice for refugee kids who come here with no Swedish, who come here with maybe very little schooling, and what they're bringing with them really that's most accessible and obvious is trauma, okay? And that's effort and sacrifice of saying this is the moment where we can really come into our own. This is where we can say, we can show what we can do with this. We can collaborate, we can set up research and development programs. And I have a reminder from 4,000 years ago. This is one of my favorite objects in the world. This is actually not it. I can't find a photograph of it. But there is, from 4,000 years ago, there's a little fragment that they found in Mesopotamia of a cuneiform writing, which is a bit of clay and a pointed stick at different, one of the earliest forms of writing, systematic writing ever. And most of the early writing, even for up until 400 or 500 years BCE, most of the writing was administrative. You will owe these taxes, you will pay these taxes, carry this tablet forward to show that I'm now your king. If you ever find out how long it took us to decode the Rosetta Stone, and all it says is I'm your new king, and I'm your king, and I'm your king, and it just goes around all these different places. It's the most boring piece of stuff ever written. Probably wrong anyway. It probably lasted 10 minutes. But here is one that isn't just administrative. This little fragment. And it says that. This is a letter from a parent to a teacher, to your professional ancestor. My son opened his hands and you allowed wisdom to come into it. You taught him how to read and write. Wisdom is the ancient world's way of summarizing skills, knowledge, and dispositions of inquiry and critique. We see it coming out in full bloom in Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and so on. But this was, this was 1,500 years before those people. We talked about that. Adaptability, discernment. We call Gramsci's thing here about this is a teacher got this letter, and this because this teacher was putting in sacrifice and effort to do the next thing. And this teacher is our ancestor, paid the price for getting us to this kind of future. And it seems to me that one of the things we have to do is understand. I've never met a teacher who doesn't have a powerful sense of personal responsibility for her or his students. What I have observed less in 40 years is an appreciation that responsibility has to be experienced collectively. There is a collective responsibility, not just because the kids go from one of you to the other, or from the auspices of one agency to another, but because it's a collective that has to connect powerfully with families and communities and workplaces and employers and so on. So it's important that we remind ourselves and use something like this to remind ourselves that we have to remind our students and their parents and the communities and the media sometimes and our politicians and our other colleagues within the education about the size of this mission. And the last 2 days have shown us that we also, it's most important that we continue to remind ourselves about that mission as well. Thank you.